They called him the Ghost, not out of fear or respect, but out of a casual, thoughtless cruelty reserved for the invisible. For 5 years, Elias Vance had haunted the pristine, white-walled corridors of St. Jude's Metropolitan, the city's most prestigious and expensive hospital. He was the old man with the mop, the stooped figure with the limp, who buffed the floors until they reflected the arrogant strides of surgeons in their $1,000 shoes. He emptied their trash cans, filled with the debris of lives saved and fortunes made. He cleaned their messes. He endured their dismissive glances, their impatient sighs, and the saccharine, condescending tone of Dr. Alastair Finch, the hospital's golden boy and chief of cardiothoracic surgery. They saw a tired, broken-down janitor with hands scarred by time and toil. They didn't know those scars weren't from bleach and floor wax. They didn't know his limp was a souvenir from a Black Hawk going down in a storm of fire and metal. They didn't know that the quiet, raspy voice they never bothered to listen to had once commanded medevac helicopters through contested airspace and talked dying men through their final, ragged breaths. They didn't expect the day would come when the most important life in their state-of-the-art facility wouldn't depend on their advanced degrees or their gleaming technology, but on the janitor they barely knew existed. Elias Vance wasn't a ghost. He was a guardian, waiting for a war he prayed would never come to his door again. The chaos in Trauma Bay 1 was a symphony of controlled panic. Beeps from a dozen monitors fought a losing battle against shouted orders and the desperate, guttural roars of the man strapped to the gurney. He was a mess of blood, torn fabric, and raw, exposed tissue. A car bomb, the paramedics had said, a targeted attack on a major political figure. The man on the table wasn't the target, he was the hero. He was Colonel Jackson Jax Davies, a man whose face was usually on the cover of magazines discussing global security, now contorted into a mask of primal agony and delirium. He thrashed against the restraints, his formidable strength, even when bleeding out, overwhelming 2 burly orderlies. "No, get back! Kilo 6, perimeter breach! I repeat, perimeter breach! Don't touch me!" His eyes were wide, unseeing, lost in a firefight a world away. Every time a nurse approached with a needle or a pressure cuff, he fought with renewed, terrifying vigor. Dr. Alastair Finch stood just outside the circle of frantic activity, his arms crossed over his pristine white coat. His handsome face, usually a mask of calm, photogenic authority, was flushed with anger and impotence. "Sedate him! For God's sake, somebody sedate him!" he barked, his voice a sharp, grating contrast to the rhythmic chaos. "We can't get a line in, Doctor," a young resident yelled back, dodging a flailing arm. "He's fighting everything we've got." "Then try harder," Finch snapped. "This is Colonel Davies. The governor has called twice. The media is already camped outside. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" The question was rhetorical, concerned not with the dying man's health, but with the hospital's public relations. The air was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sterile tang of antiseptic, a smell Elias Vance knew better than the lemon-scented polish he used on the lobby floors. He stood just inside the doorway, his mop and bucket forgotten beside him. He was supposed to be cleaning a spill in the hallway, but the sounds from the trauma bay had pulled him in, a familiar siren song of crisis he hadn't heard in years. He watched the scene, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the pulsating bleed from the femoral artery, inefficiently staunched by a paramedic's field dressing. He saw the slight, asymmetrical rise and fall of the colonel's chest, a telltale sign of a tension pneumothorax. He saw the pallor of the man's skin, the bluish tint to his lips. He saw a man with less than 5 minutes of life left in him, while the best and brightest doctors in the city flapped around him like startled birds. They had no idea that the man they were losing wasn't just a colonel. He was Jackhammer, the call sign for the fire team leader of Ghost Talon Company, a unit Elias knew intimately, a unit he had once commanded from the bloody dirt of a dozen different hells. A typical day for Elias began before the sun rose, in the quiet, humming basement of St. Jude's. The locker room for the custodial staff was small and smelled of damp concrete and industrial cleaner. Elias would slowly, methodically change out of his worn civilian clothes into the drab grey uniform that rendered him invisible. The limp was always worse in the morning, a deep, grinding ache in his left hip where a piece of shrapnel was still nestled too close to the bone to be safely removed. It was a constant, physical reminder of the day his world had ended, and this new, quiet one had begun. He would start his rounds on the top floor, the executive wing, and work his way down. This was Dr. Finch's territory, a place of hushed tones, expensive art, and panoramic city views. It was also where Elias faced his daily dose of casual degradation. "Vance!" Dr. Finch's voice echoed down the polished corridor one Tuesday morning. Elias stopped buffing the floor and turned slowly. Finch was pointing a gleaming Italian leather shoe at a spot on the marble. "Do you see this? A scuff mark. From a heel. My heel. This floor is supposed to be immaculate. My donors and board members walk this hall. What impression does this give?" Elias looked at the minuscule black mark. "I'll take care of it, sir," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You'll take care of it now," Finch corrected, a smug smile playing on his lips, as two of his resident sycophants, doctors half his age, with twice his arrogance, snickered behind him. "One would think a simple task like polishing a floor wouldn't be so challenging, but I suppose we all have our cognitive limits." He gestured dismissively and swept past, his entourage trailing in his wake like pilot fish. Elias said nothing. He simply knelt, the motion sending a sharp protest through his hip, and worked the small mark with a soft cloth until the marble gleamed, a perfect, unbroken mirror reflecting a world he was no longer a part of. He didn't think about the irony of a man like Finch, who had likely never had a callus on his hands, critiquing his work. He thought instead about the principles of triage. You don't waste time on the superficial wounds when there's a catastrophic bleed. Finch was a superficial wound. Annoying, but not life-threatening. Elias had learned to triage his emotions the same way he triaged casualties. His favorite part of the hospital, the only place that brought him a sliver of peace, was the small, often ignored memorial alcove off the main lobby. A simple granite plaque listed the names of hospital staff who had served and fallen in various conflicts. He would spend extra time there, polishing the brass frame until it shone, his gnarled fingers tracing the engraved letters. Sergeant Michael Chen, Corporal Sarah Jenkins, Private First Class David Grant. Names. Not just names, but stories. He knew their ranks. He could guess their fields. He felt a kinship with these silent, absent colleagues that he never felt with the living, breathing doctors who rushed past him every day. Sometimes he would whisper their names, a quiet benediction. It was his small act of remembrance, a duty he had assigned himself. One afternoon, a young resident, Dr. Anya Sharma, saw him there. Unlike the others, she often met his eyes and offered a quiet, "Hello." "It's good that you do that," she said softly, gesturing to the plaque. "Keeping it clean. Most people just walk by." Elias just nodded, his hands still. "They shouldn't be forgotten," he murmured. "Did you know any of them?" she asked, her curiosity gentle, not prying. Elias's gaze went distant. He thought of the faces, the names, not on this wall, but on the ones seared into his memory. "I knew men like them," he said, his voice barely audible. The answer was simple, truthful, and revealed nothing. He turned back to his work, and Dr. Sharma, sensing the conversation was over, gave a small smile and moved on. Elias watched her go, a flicker of warmth in the cold, sterile expanse of his day. He knew her type. She was a healer, not a technician, not a status seeker, a true healer. He hoped the hospital wouldn't break her. Most days, he felt certain it would. The system was designed to reward the Finches of the world, not the Sharmas. It was a truth as cold and hard as the granite wall beneath his fingers. The humiliation was a slow drip IV of poison. It wasn't one single event, but an accumulation of 1,000 tiny cuts. Dr. Finch seemed to take a special perverse pleasure in using Elias as a foil to burnish his own image. The worst incident came during a tour for a group of wealthy potential donors, the kind of people who wrote 7-figure checks to have their names carved onto new hospital wings. Finch was in his element, a peacock displaying his magnificent plumage. He was leading them down the main surgical corridor, his voice a smooth, confident baritone, as he explained the cutting-edge technology and the hospital's unparalleled success rates. As they passed, Elias was on his hands and knees, meticulously cleaning the grout between the floor tiles with a small brush, a task his supervisor had insisted upon. Finch stopped the tour directly beside him. "And here, ladies and gentlemen," he announced with theatrical flair, "you see an example of the St. Jude's difference. It's about attention to detail, from the most complex robotic surgery right down to the very floors we walk on. Nothing is overlooked." He gestured down at Elias. "Pops here knows, don't you, Pops?" The nickname was new, and it dripped with a unique blend of condescension and false familiarity. The donors, a collection of silver-haired men and women in tailored suits and jewelry that could fund a small clinic, chuckled politely. Elias didn't look up. He just continued his work, the rhythmic scrape of the brush the only sound he made. Finch wasn't done. He crouched down, placing a hand patronizingly on Elias's shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like a physical blow. "We believe that a sterile environment is paramount. It reflects a sterile mind, a focus on perfection. If our janitorial staff is this meticulous, imagine the standards we hold our surgeons to." He tapped a tile. "You missed a spot, old man. Right there." There was no spot. The tile was immaculate. It was a power play, pure and simple, a demonstration for his audience. The room went silent. The donors looked on, some with faint smiles, others with a flicker of discomfort. Elias stopped scrubbing. For a long, drawn-out moment, he remained perfectly still. The air seemed to shift, to grow heavy and tight. Inside Elias, a cold, dark tide began to rise, a feeling he hadn't let himself truly feel in years. It was the rage of a commander, watching his men be disrespected, the fury of a professional seeing his work belittled by an amateur. He could have broken Finch's wrist in a half-second. He could have used the surgeon's own condescending tone to point out the flawed logic, the sheer unprofessionalism of his display. He could have stood up and walked away. He did none of those things. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the tide recede. He was no longer that commander. He was a janitor. His war was over. So he simply picked up his cloth, wiped the non-existent spot Finch had indicated, and said, in a monotone that betrayed nothing, "My apologies, sir. I'll be more thorough." Finch beamed, his victory complete. "Excellent. That's the spirit." He stood up, brushing off his hands as if he'd touched something unclean, and led the donors away, his voice once again booming with self-importance. Elias remained on his knees until the sound of their footsteps faded. He closed his eyes. He didn't see the gleaming hallway. He saw a dusty, blood-soaked tent in the Afghan mountains. He smelled sand and cordite. He heard the screams. He remembered what it was to have real authority, the kind that came not from a title or a bank account, but from being the only person in a world of chaos who could put a man's insides back where they belonged. The memory was a dull ache, a phantom limb of a life he had been forced to amputate. He opened his eyes. The hallway was empty. He was alone with the clean, white tiles. He picked up his brush and went back to work. The alert that shattered the afternoon calm wasn't a standard code. It was a code black. Mass casualty potential, external disaster. The message crackled over the hospital-wide PA system, sharp and urgent. Within seconds, the measured pace of the hospital dissolved into a frantic, purposeful rush. Elias was on the third floor, restocking a supply closet when the call came. He felt the shift in the building's energy, a vibration he recognized in his bones. He abandoned his cart and made his way to a stairwell, his limp more pronounced as he descended, his mind already running through checklists he hadn't consciously considered in half a decade. He emerged on the ground floor near the ambulance bay just as the first vehicle screamed to a halt. It wasn't a standard city ambulance. It was a black, armored Suburban, the kind used by federal agents and high-level security details. The doors flew open, and a scene of pure bedlam spilled out. Two men in dark suits, bleeding from cuts on their faces, hauled a third man out from the back. It was Colonel Jax Davies. His expensive suit was shredded and blackened, and a dark, arterial red stained everything. The ER team, led by a sprinting Dr. Finch, swarmed the vehicle. "Get him on a gurney now! What happened?" Finch demanded. "Car bomb," one of the agents gasped, pressing a uselessly small bandage to a gaping wound in the colonel's thigh. "We were pulling up to the conference center. He pushed the senator out of the way, took the brunt of it." They got him onto the gurney and crashed through the automatic doors into Trauma Bay 1. The scene Elias had witnessed from the doorway began to unfold. The colonel, a man trained to endure unimaginable pain, was lost to the shock and the agony. His mind had retreated to the battlefield. "Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, we are pinned down. Need immediate evac. Where is Aegis? Get me Aegis!" he roared, his voice hoarse. The name sent a jolt through Elias, a shock of electricity that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Aegis. His call sign. The name he hadn't heard spoken aloud since the day they pulled him from the wreckage of the Black Hawk. "What is he talking about?" Finch yelled, his frustration mounting as the team failed to get near the patient. "Who is Aegis? Is that his doctor? Somebody get his file!" The countdown had begun. The lead trauma nurse, a seasoned veteran named Helen, shouted over the din. "He's in VTAC. BP is 60/30 and dropping. We're losing him." She pointed to the wound on his leg. "The femoral is torn to shreds, and his breathing is shallow. Possible tension pneumo on the right side." Finch just stared, paralyzed. His expertise was in the cold, controlled environment of the operating room, with a patient neatly prepped and anesthetized. This was chaos. This was war, and he was a civilian. Just hold him down, he ordered, a useless, panicked command. The two orderlies strained, but the colonel, fueled by adrenaline and delusion, was a force of nature. He was dying, and the very people trying to save him were being treated as the enemy. Elias watched the primary monitor. The jagged spikes of the heart rate were becoming weaker, the rhythm more erratic. He saw the blood pooling on the floor, a dark, growing stain that marked the seconds ticking away. He knew, with an absolute and terrifying certainty, that in less than a minute, Colonel Jax Davies would be dead. The men and women in the room were doctors, but they didn't speak the patient's language. Elias did. It was the only language he had ever truly been fluent in. The language of survival against impossible odds. He didn't make a conscious decision. It was an instinct, honed over hundreds of similar moments where hesitation meant death. Elias dropped the handle of his mop. It clattered to the floor, the sound lost in the medical cacophony. He took one step, then another, moving from the doorway into the heart of the storm. His limp was gone. His posture, usually stooped with fatigue, was suddenly erect, his shoulders squared. He moved with a purpose that parted the sea of frantic medical staff. "Hey, janitor, get the hell out of here!" Dr. Finch shrieked, his voice cracking with disbelief and fury. "This is a sterile field. Security!" Elias didn't even glance at him. His eyes were locked on Colonel Davies. He moved past a nurse holding a useless IV bag, past a resident fumbling with a defibrillator paddle. He reached the side of the gurney, placing himself directly in the path of the colonel's thrashing. He leaned in close, his mouth just inches from the dying man's ear. His voice was not the raspy murmur of the janitor. It was a low, clear, commanding tone. A voice that had cut through the roar of gunfire and the screams of the wounded. "Jackhammer, this is Aegis," he said, the words a key turning a lock deep inside the colonel's shattered mind. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Colonel Davies froze mid-roar. His thrashing ceased. His body went rigid, but it was the stillness of a soldier coming to attention, not the stillness of death. His wild, unfocused eyes blinked, then slowly, painstakingly, tried to focus on the face above him. He was still fighting, but now he was fighting to understand. Elias leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, so low that no one else in the room could hear it. He recited the words they had all sworn, an oath taken not in a pristine courthouse, but in the dust and grime of a forward operating base, their hands clasped over a battered K-bar knife. "Where iron meets flesh, we hold the line. Where blood meets sand, we draw the line. Until the last breath, for the brother beside me, we do not break." It was the blood oath of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Special Medical Detachment, a sacred vow. As the last word left Elias's lips, all the fight went out of Colonel Davies. A single tear traced a path through the grime and blood on his cheek. His body relaxed against the gurney, his eyes, now shockingly lucid, locked onto Elias. "Aegis," he breathed, the name a prayer. They said you were dead." "Report was exaggerated," Elias stated flatly, his hands already moving. The room was now dead silent, save for the faltering beeps of the monitor. The entire medical team, including Dr. Finch, was frozen in a state of collective shock. They were witnessing something impossible. The janitor had done in 10 seconds what they had failed to do in 10 minutes. Elias's hands were a blur of motion. He ripped off his own belt and, with brutal efficiency, cinched it high and tight on the colonel's thigh, directly over the shredded femoral artery. He twisted it with a discarded pair of trauma shears until the pulsating flow of blood slowed to a desperate ooze. "Someone get pressure on this now," he commanded, not looking to see who obeyed. The lead nurse, Helen, snapped out of her stupor and pressed down with both hands. Elias's eyes darted to the colonel's chest. He saw the distended neck veins, the tracheal deviation. Tension pneumothorax. No time for a chest tube kit. His hand went to the breast pocket of his own grey uniform and pulled out a simple ballpoint pen. He clicked it, then unceremoniously snapped the plastic casing in two, retaining the hollow ink tube. Without a moment's hesitation, he located the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, a spot he could find in his sleep, and plunged the plastic tube directly into the colonel's chest. There was a soft, sickening hiss of escaping air. The colonel's chest, which had been dangerously asymmetrical, immediately began to rise and fall in a more even rhythm. The oxygen saturation number on the monitor, which had been plummeting into the low 80s, ticked up. 88, 90, 92. It was a crude, barbaric, and breathtakingly effective move. It had just saved the man's life. Elias looked up, his eyes scanning the stunned faces around him. "I need a large-bore IV, O-negative blood, and a fast scanner. 5 minutes ago." His voice held no pleading, no request. It was an order. The spell of silence was shattered by Dr. Finch. His face was a mask of apoplectic rage and profound confusion. He saw a janitor, a menial worker, not only touching a patient, but performing invasive procedures with makeshift tools in his ER. It was an affront to every rule, every hierarchy he held dear. "What in God's name do you think you are doing?" he finally sputtered, taking a step forward. "You just assaulted a patient. You punctured his lung." Elias didn't bother to look at him. His attention was on the colonel's abdomen, noting the rigidity, the swelling, internal bleeding. Major. "I relieved a tension pneumothorax that was about to cause a cardiac tamponade," Elias corrected him, his voice dangerously calm. He pointed to the monitor. "Note the improved oxygen saturation." "You're welcome." The dry, dismissive comment hung in the air like a slap. "I don't care what you think you did." Finch advanced, his hand reaching out to grab Elias's shoulder, to physically haul him away. "Security! Get this lunatic out of my trauma bay now!" The moment Finch's fingers brushed his shoulder, Elias moved. It wasn't a fast movement, but it was impossibly swift. He didn't even look up from the patient. His left hand shot out and clamped around Finch's wrist. It wasn't a violent grip, but it was as unyielding as forged steel. Finch froze, his eyes wide with shock at the janitor's strength. "Let go of me," he hissed. Elias's voice dropped several degrees, becoming something cold and lethal. "Doctor," he said, the title an insult. "Your hand is contaminating my field. If you touch me again, or if you interfere in any way, Colonel Davies will die. Your hesitation has already cost him pints. His abdomen is filling with blood. He needs a laparotomy and a thoracotomy, and he doesn't have time to make it to your sterile OR." He released Finch's wrist with a slight shove, as if discarding a piece of trash. "Now, I asked for a fast scanner and O-negative blood. Or is that task also beyond your cognitive limits?" He had thrown Finch's own words back in his face. The insult was so precise, so unexpected, that Finch physically recoiled, speechless. The lead nurse, Helen, made a decision. She looked from the stabilized breathing of the patient to the janitor's impossibly confident hands, to her own chief's sputtering, useless rage. She turned to a younger nurse. "Get the fast scanner from Bay 3 and call the blood bank. Stat!" The order broke the paralysis. The team, now ignoring Finch, began to move, their actions orbiting the quiet, authoritative figure of the janitor. The scanner was rolled in. Elias snatched the probe, squirted gel on the colonel's belly, and expertly maneuvered it. The image that appeared on the screen was a mess of grey and black. Free fluid in Morrison's pouch and the splenorenal recess. Massive hemoperitoneum. Elias diagnosed instantly, interpreting the ultrasound with a skill that took most residents months to learn. Then, a new complication arose. A nurse, reading from a tablet, called out, "Sir, the colonel's file just came through. He has a rare blood clotting disorder, von Willebrand disease. He also has a custom-made vascular stent near his aortic arch from a previous injury. We can't just start cutting." The news hit the room like a physical blow. Finch saw his opportunity to regain control. "See?" he crowed, a shrill edge to his voice. "I told you, this is complex. We can't just cowboy this. He needs specialized care. Protocols. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Elias looked up from the scanner, his gaze finally meeting Finch's. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something far worse. Pity. "The stent," Elias said, his voice flat, "is a 2.5-centimeter bifurcated endograft, deployed via femoral access to repair a dissecting aneurysm caused by shrapnel in the Kandahar province 10 years ago. I know this because I was the medic who held his aorta together with my fingers for 27 minutes in a shaking helicopter while they flew us to the field hospital." He turned his attention back to the patient. "His von Willebrand is type 1. It'll complicate the bleeding, but we can manage it with desmopressin, if you have any." He didn't ask. He stated. The depth of knowledge, the sheer irrefutable authority, was absolute. Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery, stood in the center of his own ER, utterly and completely out of his depth. He had no idea what to do. He could only stare as the world he commanded crumbled around him, brought down by the man who cleaned his floors. Just as the team was scrambling to find the desmopressin, a new sound cut through the hospital's controlled chaos. It wasn't the familiar wail of an ambulance, it was the deep, guttural thrum of multiple heavy-duty engines, accompanied by the sharp chirp of European-style sirens. Outside the glass doors of the ER entrance, a convoy of black, government-plated SUVs screeched to a halt, boxing in the remaining news vans and scattering reporters. Doors flew open, and men in sharp suits and military police uniforms, armed with rifles held at a low ready, formed a cordon around the entrance. The hospital's own security guards, looking bewildered and hopelessly outmatched, simply backed away, raising their hands. The main doors of the ER burst open with such force that they slammed against their stoppers. A man strode in, and the very atmosphere of the room changed. He was in his late 60s, tall and ramrod straight, wearing the immaculate dress uniform of a 4-star general of the United States Army. Stars glittered on his shoulders, and a chest full of ribbons told the story of a lifetime at war. His face was a craggy landscape of command, his eyes sharp and accustomed to instant obedience. This was General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man who could make presidents tremble. He was flanked by 2 grim-faced military aides. "Where is Colonel Davies?" he boomed, his voice a gravelly force of nature that silenced every beep and every whisper in the room. His eyes, blazing with fury and fear, swept across the scene. He saw the blood, the frantic nurses, the pale, useless-looking doctor in the expensive white coat. Then his gaze moved past them all, to the stooped figure in the grey janitor's uniform who was leaning over the gurney, his hands covered in blood. The general's eyes widened, his jaw went slack. The fury on his face dissolved, replaced by a wave of utter, stupefied disbelief. He took a hesitant step forward. Aegis? The name was a whisper, a ghost of a word, filled with a decade of grief and loss. My God! Elias? Is that you? Dr. Finch, desperate to re-establish some semblance of his authority in front of this terrifying new arrival, stepped forward. General, I am Dr. Finch, Chief of Surgery. This man is a janitor. He has interfered with a patient. General Thorne didn't even look at him. He continued to stare at Elias, his eyes shining. They told me you died in the crash. Your name is on the wall at Hereford, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elias finally looked up, his gaze meeting the general's. A flicker of something, recognition, shared history, pain, passed between them. The wall is for heroes, General, Elias said quietly. I just got tired. Finch, utterly bewildered, tried again. General, with all due respect, who is Aegis? This man needs to be removed. This time, the general turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, and full of menace. He fixed Dr. Finch with a stare so cold, so filled with contempt, that Finch physically flinched. Doctor, Thorne began, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet growl that was far more frightening than his earlier boom. Let me educate you. That janitor is Master Sergeant Elias Vance. For his actions in the Zahir Valley, where he single-handedly defended a makeshift aid station for 72 hours against overwhelming enemy forces, saving the lives of 17 wounded men, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He is the man they called Aegis, the guardian of the 75th Ranger Regiment, arguably the finest combat medic this country has ever produced. The general took a step closer, invading Finch's personal space. The doctor tried to retreat, but found his back against a supply cart. Master Sergeant Vance has saved more lives with a roll of duct tape and a pocket knife in a sandstorm than you will ever see on your polished operating table, Thorne continued, his voice a low hiss. The man on that table is alive right now because of him. Colonel Davies is alive because of him, and my own life was saved by him in a bombed-out schoolhouse in a god-forsaken corner of the world that you couldn't find on a map. He poked a rigid finger into Finch's chest. So, from this moment forward, you will refer to him as Master Sergeant. You will give him anything he asks for, without question and without delay. And then you will shut your mouth. Is that understood, Doctor? The title was a venomous epithet. The entire emergency room was suffocatingly silent. Every eye was on Finch, waiting for his response. Doctor.
Alistair Finch's world
had been built on a foundation of credentials, status, and the carefully cultivated deference of others. In the space of 30 seconds, General Thorne had taken a sledgehammer to that foundation, and now it was crumbling into dust beneath his feet. His handsome face, usually tanned and confident, cycled through a humiliating spectrum of colors, from flushed red to blotchy pink to finally a ghastly, bloodless white. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The sycophantic nurses and residents who had once laughed at his jokes and rushed to do his bidding now stared at him with a mixture of shock and dawning contempt. They weren't looking at their esteemed chief of surgery anymore. They were looking at a fool, a fraud. Elias, now formally and irrevocably in command, paid him no mind.
He had a patient to save.
"His pressure is dropping again," he announced to the room, his voice cutting through the thick silence. The fast scan showed a massive hemoperitoneum. "He's bleeding out internally. The shrapnel from Kandahar must have shifted and torn the graft. I need to get into his chest and belly, right here, right now." He looked at the lead nurse, Helen, his eyes conveying the urgency. "I need a full cardiothoracic tray, a jiggly saw for the sternum, and 2 large-bore chest tubes. Prep for an emergency exploratory laparotomy and a median sternotomy." Finch finally found his voice, a high, reedy thing that held none of its former authority. "You can't! That's insane! We can't perform an open-heart procedure and a laparotomy in the ER. It's against every protocol. The risk of infection is... The risk of him bleeding to death in the next 3 minutes is 100%. Elias shot back without missing a beat. "His protocols," he gestured to Finch, "are for patients who aren't actively dying. My protocols are for this." General Thorne stepped between Finch and the gurney, a human wall of granite and fury. "You heard him," Thorne growled. "Get in the damn tools." He then turned to one of his aides. "Get the Secretary of Defense on the line. I'm invoking the Emergency War Powers Act, Article 5, regarding medical authority over a critical military asset. As of right now, this hospital's trauma bay is under my command, and I am delegating that command to Master Sergeant Vance. Anyone who interferes will be charged with obstruction and sedition." The threat was legally dubious but tactically brilliant. It stripped Finch of his last shred of institutional power. Defeated, Finch could only nod numbly. The nurses, now galvanized by Elias's clear, confident commands, flew into action. Trays were brought. Sterile drapes were laid, not perfectly, but functionally. A nurse slapped a scalpel into Elias's outstretched hand. He made the first, long, deep incision from the xiphoid process down past the navel, with a hand as steady as a rock. Blood welled, but his movements were precise, efficient. He was a master craftsman at his bench. Finch, compelled by some lingering sense of duty, or perhaps just the sheer horror of being seen as useless, tried to assist. He stepped forward, forceps in hand. I can provide suction," he offered weakly. Elias was already deep in the patient's abdomen, his hands moving with uncanny speed. "Just keep the field clear." As clamps were needed, as suction was required, Finch tried to anticipate. But his hands, which were so steady when showing off for residents, now trembled. He fumbled a hemostat, dropping it with a clatter. Elias didn't even look up. "Get out of my way," he snapped. He glanced at Dr. Sharma, the young resident who had shown him kindness at the memorial wall. "Doctor, step in. I need you to retract the peritoneum. Right there. Hold it steady." Anya Sharma, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, did exactly as she was told, her hands surprisingly firm. Finch was left standing to the side, a ghost in his own operating theatre, holding a useless instrument, a publicly shamed and impotent king in a deposed court. The man who had mocked the janitor for a non-existent scuff mark was now watching that same janitor perform one of the most complex emergency procedures imaginable, with more skill and grace than he had ever possessed. The humiliation was absolute. It was deafening. It was complete. The air in Trauma Bay 1 was a tense, humming thing, thick with the smell of blood and ozone from the cautery unit. The only sounds were the steady beep of the slowly stabilizing heart monitor, the quiet hiss of the ventilator, and Elias's low, clipped commands. More suction here. Clamp. Suture. 4-0 silk. All right, I've got the bleeder. It's a tear at the aortic graft anastomosis, just like I thought. For 27 minutes, a grim echo of that long-ago helicopter ride, Elias's hands moved with a fluid, terrifying grace inside Colonel Davies's chest and abdomen. He was not just a surgeon, he was a battlefield artist. He repaired the torn aorta with stitches so fine and precise they seemed impossible. He located and removed 2 large pieces of twisted metal shrapnel, dropping them with a metallic clink into a steel basin. He irrigated the abdominal cavity, checked for any other sources of bleeding, and then began the long, methodical process of closing. Dr. Sharma, the young resident, had performed flawlessly, her initial fear replaced by a deep, focused concentration.
She was witnessing a masterclass.
A lesson more valuable than anything she had learned in medical school. Finally, Elias placed the last stitch. He stripped off the bloody gloves and dropped them onto the tray. "He's stable," he announced, his voice raw with exhaustion. "Get him typed and crossed for 6 units. Continue the desmopressin drip for the next 12 hours and move him to the surgical ICU. 1-to-1 nursing. I want his vitals monitored continuously." He had just laid out a post-operative plan with more clarity than Dr. Finch had ever managed. The tension in the room broke. A collective, silent sigh of relief went through the staff. The beeping of the monitor was now strong and steady. Colonel Jax Davies was alive. Elias finally straightened up, his back screaming in protest. The adrenaline that had held him ramrod straight was fading, and the old familiar ache of his hip returned with a vengeance. He was covered in another man's blood, his cheap grey janitor's uniform transformed into the grim vestments of his former life. He looked down at his hands, not the scarred, gnarled hands of a cleaner, but the instruments that had, once again, cheated death. He felt a profound, soul-deep weariness. General Thorne approached him, his hard military bearing softened by an overwhelming sense of gratitude and relief. He didn't offer a salute or a handshake. Instead, he placed a heavy, warm hand on Elias's shoulder. "Elias," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we all thought you were gone. After the crash, they found the wreckage but not you. We held a memorial." "It was better that way," Elias rasped, his eyes distant. "I was done. The war was done with me." "The war is never done with men like us," Thorne said softly. He squeezed his shoulder. "Thank you, Master Sergeant. You saved a good man today." From the gurney, a weak voice croaked.
It was Colonel Davies,
his eyes fluttering open, now lucid and aware. He looked past the doctors, past the general, his gaze finding Elias. "Aegis," he whispered, his voice barely there. "Knew you'd come. You always do." Elias simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement between soldiers. The young resident, Dr. Sharma, approached him hesitantly, holding out a bottle of water. Her eyes, which had always held a quiet kindness, were now filled with a brilliant, shining awe. "Master Sergeant Vance," she said, her voice trembling slightly, I have never seen anything like that. It was an honor." The other nurses and doctors, the ones who had ignored him, stepped aside for him, their faces a mixture of shame, respect, and disbelief. He was no longer the ghost. He was a legend, returned from the grave. The quiet janitor was gone, and in his place stood the hero they never knew they had. In the weeks that followed, the fallout at St. Jude's Metropolitan was seismic. Dr.
Alistair Finch was not just fired.
He was publicly and professionally obliterated. General Thorne, true to his word, had initiated a formal inquiry through the Department of Defense. It turned out that Finch had embellished his credentials, exaggerated his success rates, and fostered a toxic environment of fear and sycophancy. Faced with lawsuits from the colonel's family and an investigation that threatened to expose even more malfeasance, the hospital board severed ties with him immediately. His medical license was suspended, pending a review that everyone knew he would not survive. The last anyone heard, he was facing financial ruin and a level of public disgrace from which he would never recover. The peacock's feathers had been plucked, leaving him naked and shivering in the cold light of reality. The hospital itself was forced into a period of intense and painful introspection. General Thorne's report was scathing, highlighting the institutional arrogance that had allowed a man like Finch to flourish, while a man like Elias Vance was relegated to cleaning floors. New policies were implemented, a new chief of surgery was hired, a decorated army surgeon recommended by Thorne himself. And in the main lobby, next to the small granite memorial that Elias had so carefully tended, a new, larger plaque was installed. It didn't list the names of donors. It was dedicated to Master Sergeant Elias Aegis Vance, and it told the story of what had happened in Trauma Bay 1. It was a permanent, shining reminder that heroes could be found in the most unexpected of places. Elias never mopped another floor at St. Jude's. The day after the incident, General Thorne had him flown to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. There, the best orthopedic surgeons in the country operated on his hip, finally removing the piece of shrapnel that had plagued him for years. The surgery was a success. His limp, the constant, grinding reminder of his fall from the sky, was gone. But Thorne had more than just a medical procedure in mind. He sat with Elias in his private recovery room, the Washington Monument visible through the window. "I'm not letting you disappear again, Elias," the general said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your country needs you, not on the front lines anymore, but we need your knowledge. We need your hands to teach, not just to heal." He offered Elias a position, senior instructor for the Combat Medic Training Program, a civilian role with a rank and salary equivalent to a full colonel. He would be responsible for shaping the next generation of Aegis medics. At first, Elias refused. The quiet life, the anonymity, had been a shield. But as he looked at the young, determined faces of the soldiers who came to visit him in the hospital, sent by Colonel Davies, who was making a full recovery, he saw the same fire, the same dedication he once had. He saw the need. He saw a new kind of line to hold. 2 months later, Master Sergeant, retired, Elias Vance, stood before a lecture hall filled with 200 of the Army's brightest medic candidates. He wore a crisp, new instructor's uniform, a deep blue that matched his eyes. He stood tall, with no trace of a limp. His scarred hands rested on the lectern. He looked out at the sea of young faces, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He looked at his reflection in the polished surface of the lectern. He didn't see a ghost. He didn't see a tired old janitor. He saw a guardian, a teacher, a soldier who had finally, truly, come home. "My name is Elias Vance," he began, his voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent hall. "Forget everything you think you know about saving lives. Today, your real training begins."